Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman here in our Northwest Side studio.
And I'm Paris Schutz reporting live from Chicago's Bucktown neighborhood.
On the show tonight, what today's Supreme Court decision means for Chicago DACA recipients. Celebrating Juneteenth, the emancipation of enslaved people. The challenges Black fathers face at a time of unrest. A photographer remembers capturing the civil rights movement. And famed architect Louis Sullivan's final work is up for sale.
First, Brandis, I'm co-anchoring tonight from Chicago's Bucktown and Wicker Park areas, the trendy neighborhoods on the northwest side. These neighborhoods did suffer property damage 3 weeks ago as businesses were emerging from the COVID-19 shutdown. We'll have more on how the communities are rebuilding, but first we toss it back to you.
Paris, thank you. More missed deadlines for the Chicago Police Department. A second report from the federally appointed independent monitor tasked with assessing police compliance with the consent decree says the department met 22 deadlines for the reporting period, but missed 52. Overall, the police department has met 35 of the deadlines laid out in the consent decree for year one and missed 89. In a statement, independent monitor Maggie Hickey says, quote, the recent grief, outrage, protests, and unrest spurred by the tragic death of George Floyd demonstrate the urgent need for police reform across the country and here in Chicago. And the mayor and police department responded jointly, saying, quote, the level of transformational change and reform that we are working towards cannot be achieved overnight. This moment is just the start, not the end of our journey. Starting on Monday, though, more Chicagoans will be able to enjoy the Lakefront Trail and the 606. But Mayor Lori Lightfoot says, don't dawdle.
We're going to emphasize to keep it moving. We want the public to enjoy these iconic opportunities in the outdoors, but we want everyone to do this safely.
Lightfoot also praised billionaire hedge fund manager Ken Griffin for a $4.75 million donation to repair the Lakefront Trail, which has been damaged by winter storms and rising lake levels. Both the Lakefront Trail and the 606 have been closed since March 26th. Separately, Lightfoot also called on Governor J.B. Pritzker to allow restaurants to reopen indoor diners sooner rather than later. Students at the University of Illinois will return to campus for fall 2020, but in a modified structure. In an email to the school community today, Chancellor Robert Jones says the semester will blend in-person and remote instruction. It also says resuming on-campus classes is dependent on both the state moving into phase 4 of its reopening plan and the ability to provide enough COVID-19 testing to faculty, staff, and students. Anyone on campus will, of course, be required to follow current guidelines for face masks and social distancing. And another Chicago theater announces it won't be coming back after the pandemic. Just one day after the Mercury Theater announced it was permanently closing, news that comedy venue, the I.O. Theater, formerly known as Improv Olympic, is also closing up shop for good. The theater helped launch the careers of some of the biggest names in American comedy, including Bill Murray and John Belushi. But owner Charna Halpern released a statement saying the pandemic had, quote, made the financial struggle too difficult and I can't even see light at the end of the tunnel at this point. Halpern and the theater were recently accused of racism in a petition posted on change.org that's attracted more than 2,500 signatures. Halpern says the petition is not why I.O. is closing. Businesses across Chicago are starting to dig out of the double whammy of COVID-19 closures and recent property damage. The Bucktown Wicker Park area, like so many other commercial corridors, was hit with heavy property damage, especially during unrest that happened 3 weeks ago Sunday. Paris Schutz spent the day reporting in what are considered sometimes trendy and posh neighborhoods, but he joins us in Bucktown right beside the 606, the popular elevated trail that's also been closed for a while. Paris.
Yeah, Brandis, it's been closed for a while, but it is scheduled to reopen on Monday, although tell that to the steady stream of bikers and runners that we've been seeing there all day today already. It's another sure sign that these communities are reemerging from the COVID-19 shutdown and the unrest over the last 3 weeks. As you look right now at the historic Flatiron building at the Six Corners intersection, North Damon and Milwaukee, it was an area that suffered extensive damage 3 weeks ago just as businesses were slowly reopening. A lot of boarded up storefronts have been creatively and colorfully painted to give the community some new life. Now, Peace Pizza and Brewery is a local restaurant we visited back in mid-March before the shutdown even began. We talked then to owner Bill Jacobs, who was concerned about the loss in business when we all thought this might only last a few weeks. Here's what he said back then about what he felt like he could maintain.
A fraction. We're talking 30% of what we normally do. So this is it's a significant hit to what we do, and I know that other people are experiencing the same thing.
Fast forward 3 months, Jacobs did get some of that federal PPP funding. He says he hired all of his employees back, and he says the community really stepped up with some of the takeout and pickup orders. He says he's now preparing to open his dining room in 2 weeks in a socially distant manner.
We've been fortunately busy, so it's not what it was. You know, we're basically covering our costs. We have quite a bit of overhead, and we're not making money, but we're able to survive, and that really is the most important thing at this time.
And another favorite local shop is Reckless Records, which has just begun to let in a limited amount of customers after spending the last 3 months selling its extensive stock of records and CDs and tapes online. The store was also able to keep afloat financially by selling some mint condition rare records on eBay that it had been holding on to for a while.
Some of these records, we sold for $1,000, $1,200, things like that. And it's really difficult for us to sell things like that in the store because, when someone walks in and they see a record with a $1,000 price tag, it's kind of like, what am I going to do with this? You know what I mean? But by selling it online, you reach that person that this is the record I've been looking for 10 years, and here it is.
Most of those records were some vintage jazz records from the famed label Blue Note. So down the block on Milwaukee, there's Volumes Book Cafe. It's taking appointments right now just to be able to browse inside. And owner Rebecca George says the community also stepped up for her by ordering books online. And it's no secret which books right now are the most popular. It's the ones that deal with the very difficult discussions around race that are happening at this moment.
Right now, in the last few weeks, it looks like people really want to put in the work and have more understanding of themselves and of, how do they combat racist ideologies? How do they teach their kids, not to be racist? How do they, and so, yeah, we've had hundreds upon hundreds of orders for these books, which we're happy about. I think this community is very self-aware and, trying to get everybody on the same page.
But George does say she worries about Milwaukee Avenue there. All those local independent businesses like hers, the rents are very high, and with the mom and pop shops doing only a fraction of what they normally do, she fears that the character of that street might drastically change in the coming months.
Right now, no one's making what they normally would be making, and I think you're going to start to see, as the months roll on, more and more vacancies just because of that. No one can keep up the already ridiculous rents that are in the neighborhood.
We'll have to watch for that. Now, the neighborhood is also served by Amita Presence St. Mary's Health Center. Really serves a lot of nearby Humboldt Park as well. And Chief Medical Officer Dr. Laura Kincannon says the current trends give her optimism that the city has made it through the recent protests without a spike in COVID.
We're definitely seeing the downside of this surge in recent weeks. In fact, it's come down quite quickly. We were a little bit concerned after some of the recent gatherings related to some of the social unrest in the area, and also coincident with the reopening of the city. When you look at the time period that it takes for transmission of the disease, and then add to that the time period at which people start to have serious symptoms, we would have seen an uptick in the last few days if we were going to.
And we'll be back in a bit with more on some local businesses that really provide flavor here in Bucktown and Wicker Park. Independent music venues, what are their future? More with that in a bit, but now, Brandis, we toss it back to you.
Thanks, Paris. Yeah, I like Dr. Kincannon's optimism. Thank you. President Donald Trump cannot end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA program. The U.S. Supreme Court today issued a decision, surprising to many, that blocks the president from rescinding the Obama-era program. What does that mean for the so-called dreamers who came to the United States and to Chicago as children? Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more. Amanda.
Brandis, today's ruling is a personal one for DACA participants like Carlos Benitez, who immigrated to the U.S. from Mexico City when he was just 4 years old. He says his parents were always upfront with he and his siblings about their undocumented status.
They didn't want us to feel that we had to be shameful of who we were or that we had to hide. So they were always really open about our situation, right? And I think that was also for safety, right, for precautions.
The DACA program means that individuals like Benitez can remain in the U.S. without fear of deportation. He says it's validating. But immigration attorney Moises Hernandez says President Trump's attempt to end it, along with the president's general rhetoric about rounding up and deporting immigrants, has left many of his clients feeling anxious, trying to go to work, go to college, buy a house.
Living with the daily news of it's going to be taken down, or it's at the Supreme Court, or it's at the federal court, and I can wake up tomorrow and this can all be gone. Imagine any of us planning our lives around that precarious status.
Today's decision means that his clients can rest easy, but not completely. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, did not make a constitutional ruling on DACA. Rather, the justices says that President Trump's administration did not go about ending it the right way.
What the court said today is that the Trump administration didn't even pass the extremely low bar of the Administrative Procedure Act. In other words, in the language of the act, the Trump administration action was arbitrary and capricious. That's extremely sloppy.
Regardless, Benitez is happy with the result. His student group held a Zoom celebration.
You know, honestly, it's a good day. And I'll take a good day during a pandemic, anytime.
Well, this ruling does give DACA participants breathing room. He says that there's still a lot of work ahead. Ana Mosqueda is an 8-year DACA recipient who describes the ruling as bittersweet.
Being DACA is a very difficult experience because today it's like a victory, right? Like we did it, but it also is selfish in a way because our families are still forgotten. They still don't qualify for anything that we qualify. There's still the fear of deportation.
Particularly given the president's reaction, President Trump taking to Twitter to say, I am asking for a legal solution on DACA, not a political one consistent with the rule of law. The Supreme Court is not willing to give us one. So now we will have to start this process all over again. Illinois' senior U.S. Senator Dick Durbin says he's asking the president to not go that route, especially now.
Out of the 700,000 or 600,000 number of DACA-protected young people, 200,000 of them are in essential employment in the midst of this crisis that we're facing. 40,000 are the healthcare heroes that we cheer every night. The doctors and nurses and medical professionals. Why would we ever want to get rid of them in the midst of this battle against this virus?
Durbin is looking to November and hopes that there's going to be a change in the White House. After celebrating today, Hernandez also says that immigration rights activists have to keep their eye on the prize.
The real resolution is Congress needs to act on passing legislation that provides a path to permanent status for all these individuals.
Now, they're not alone in looking to the coming election. President Trump using today's decision to try to rally his base as well, tweeting that if the radical left Democrats assume power, gun, abortion, and secure border rights will be, quote, over and gone. Now, on a note related to immigration, in the new state budget set to take effect just next month, Illinois is set to become the first state to provide Medicaid health care benefits to seniors who are undocumented. Brandis, back to you.
Amanda, thank you. And now to Phil Ponce and community members sounding the alarm about COVID-19 rates. Phil.
Brandis, while the rate of coronavirus infections across all Illinois communities has slowed, the infection rate in Illinois' Latino communities has continued to climb, with total numbers of infections on track to comprise half of all COVID-19 cases in the state. Now, as Latino communities scramble to understand why the coronavirus has hit them so hard, they're calling upon elected officials to do more to help reverse the trend of rising infection rates. Joining us to talk about how COVID-19 is impacting Latino communities is Dr. Marina Del Rios. She's Director of Social Emergency Medicine at the University of Illinois at Chicago. State Senator Celina Villanueva, whose district includes Aurora, Naperville, and Joliet, and Carmen Vergara. She's Chief Operating Officer of Esperanza Health Centers, and thank you all for joining us. Dr. Del Rios, can you give us a quick overview as to what the trends are for COVID-19 infection in the Latino community?
Well, what we're seeing is that while the rest of the communities have seen a downward trend in the positivity rate of infection for people that are getting tested for COVID-19, in the Latino community, that decrease has not been on par. So while, for example, in the city of Chicago, the positive test rate is somewhere in the 5 to 6% range overall, in the Latino community, it remains over 20%. And this even taking into consideration that the percent of the population that's actually getting tested is smaller too. And what that's led to is also a very high, what we're seeing is a very high incidence rate in the population where pretty much we can say that 2% of Latinos have either been infected or are currently infected with COVID.
And we're looking at a ward map of the city of Chicago. We were just looking at one showing where the concentrations are. And Carmen Vergara, what are some reasons Latino might be especially hard hit?
So most of Latinos are working class, and they do not have the privilege to work from home. And the stay-at-order policy really protected those that could afford to stay sheltered at home. In addition, they are proportionally affected by chronic conditions like diabetes and hypertension because of issues of poverty and lack of access to healthcare, medication, insurance, technology, and on and on. And so the issues of those that are left blank is concerning because if they are in fact Latino, then we may be at a deeper disadvantage when we see wave 2 start.
And Senator Villanueva, what are you seeing in your district that might explain these high rates?
Well, Phil, my district is actually on the southwest side of the city of Chicago and the southwest suburbs. So I have 4 out of the 5 top COVID positive rate zip codes in my district. It includes communities like Little Village, Brighton Park, West Lawn, Elton, big chunks of the southwest side. And, truth is that we're seeing the numbers because a lot of our folks are people that are in the service industry, folks that work at grocery stores, folks that work, cleaning up hospitals, janitorial staff, people that work at hotels, people that work at airports. The list is very long. Again, these are essential workers. And so we're seeing these numbers because these are the folks that don't have options to stay at home and say, I'm going to do my job at home. They're the folks that are having to make ends meet and having to go out because that's how they pay their bills. There's no other way around it.
Carmen Vergara, there's also an issue, as I understand it, about how the data is collected, and specifically there's an ethnicity category in the reporting apparatus that is left blank for a large segment of confirmed cases. Could you expand on what that is all about?
Sure. So there are a few factors that I would say more broadly affecting everyone are technology issues. Electronic medical records are not the best at standardizing how this information is collected.
Excuse me, because we're seeing a pie chart right now. You can't see it, but the green shows that almost a third of the cases it's left blank in the ethnicity category. I'm sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, so race and ethnicity are also very complex concepts. And not everyone in the Latino community particularly agree with or identify with the categories that the government has given us to choose from. And so personally myself, I often leave race blank, but I choose, my ethnicity. In addition to, there are also privacy concerns specific to the Latino community where they wonder what agencies have access to this information. And so those two reasons particularly affect Latinos specifically. So there is suspicion that those that are left blank are Latinos.
Dr. Del Rios, what leads you to believe that many of those in the, quote, left blank category are actually Latino?
Well, I think I would just amplify what Carmen just stated. I think a lot of it is privacy concerns. If you're undocumented, you start questioning who's going to get this information. Am I going to get in trouble? Is somebody going to come after me or my family? And again, the technology issue is a big problem. You know, if you have an electronic health record that is antiquated, that there's some electronic health records that don't even have this as a mandatory field. The issue of not making that part of just a general demographic composition that we collect on everyone on other things like age and sex, this should be just part of those demographic variables that we're collecting to get a better sense of the public health impact in our populations.
Senator Villanueva, so according to this, just to make clear that I understand it, according to the statistics that now exist, Latinos are closing in on being half of the number, but based on what we're hearing about this left blank issue, the numbers could be much higher. Why is it important for this data to be accurate?
I mean, it's imperative for it to be accurate. We knew going into this that health disparities existed, particularly for Latino and African American communities, and it gets even more complex when we talk about socioeconomic status. And so when we're talking about the solutions, how do we actually get out of this? How do we help provide resources for the communities that really need it? The data is imperative, because if the data tells us that the need is in Naperville, but it's inaccurate data that actually isn't really telling us the full story, that what the need is you know, in neighborhoods like Little Village, which is what we've seen with the zip code, the more accurate the information that we get, the more that we're able to actually find better solutions in terms of resources. But then also, you know, and I'm not a doctor, and I'll leave that to Dr. De Rios, but even, you know, how that plays into our healthcare, how that plays into our you know, getting better from, or, you know, helping to prevent, you know, the spread, you know, everything down to contact tracing, because you're going to have to perform different activities in contact tracing for different communities.
Carmen Vergara, what can the state government do to make their data collection more accurate so that the resources go where they really are needed?
So I think one thing, like right off the bat, is making that field a required mandatory field on the disease surveillance reporting system. I think that is something that's low-hanging fruit that we could implement rather quickly. Long term, it's a bigger discussion on what healthcare should be doing to improve the collection of this data and other sensitive data such as sexual orientation and gender identity. That's also another area where health centers struggle to collect that very necessary information.
Last question, this is a big picture question. Dr. Del Rios, the White House appears to be downplaying COVID as a pressing issue. What is your reaction to that as a physician?
I will be glad to invite any of them to walk into my emergency department and see the patients that I'm seeing every day. Yes, the numbers have gone down, but it's not gone. And now that we're reopening the economy, if we don't have adequate protections in place for our workers, those numbers are going to continue to rise again. And my concern is that, again, taking the overall number and not paying attention to what's happening in our marginalized communities is a huge mistake, and it's going to have repercussions to the greater population.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. Dr. Del Rios, Carmen Vergara, and Senator Villanueva, thank you all for joining us. We very much appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And up next, we check in with Paris Schutz, who's in Chicago's Wicker Park neighborhood. But first, a look at the weather.
Still to come on Chicago Tonight. Meet a photographer of the civil rights movement who photographed James Baldwin and Dr. King. How Black fathers prepare their children to avoid violence, both when dealing with the police and in their communities. A look at a unique work by master Chicago architect Louis Sullivan.
For me, as a relative, it's old and yet new at the same time. I'm used to watching.
And Angelito shares family memories of Juneteenth in Texas and tells us about the holiday in Chicago. But first, we check back in with Paris Schutz, who's co-anchoring from Chicago's Wicker Park, Bucktown area tonight. Paris.
Yeah, Brandis, we're joined now by 32nd Ward Alderman and Chairman of the Finance Committee on City Council, Alderman Scott Waguespack. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Paris.
So we've talked a lot about some of the property damage that happened a few weeks ago on the south and west sides, but Milwaukee Avenue, Wicker Park, Bucktown were hit pretty bad. Tell us your experience those nights.
Well, we had some pretty intense stuff going on, looting of a lot of our small businesses, obviously some of the big stores too, but we were really concerned about the viability of our small business owners and just seeing a lot of their property damage, and a lot of them live upstairs from their shops. It was really devastating to see that so many people were kind of flooding into this area from even out of state.
And you said it looked like coordinated groups just kind of going from one store to the next.
Yeah, if you've seen the Fast and Furious movie, it looked like that. There were several pockets of those groups going from store to store, different parts of the neighborhood, all the way up to Logan Square. So it was pretty intense couple of evenings.
And we spoke with some of the small businesses along Milwaukee today that seem to be doing all right. How are the small businesses in general around here?
Well, I think they're doing okay. We've worked very closely with all of our 5 chambers in this area, the community area, especially the Wicker Park Bucktown Chamber, just making sure that we're getting any of the funds that we can from both the feds, from the state, and from our local resiliency fund to get that out to those businesses and make sure that they've got the funds they need to get back up on their feet again.
Let's hope our viewers heard that with the Blue Line train going back up behind you over the 606. Speaking of the 606, it opens Monday. We do see people up there right now. There's a couple of bikers. Is it ready to be open safely?
I think it is. We're at that point where, listening to the public health director, we've got those numbers coming down, but we still need to be careful. You and I are social distancing, but we've got to make sure everybody that goes up there does as well. You're either wearing a mask or staying pretty far away from someone. And it'll be open on Monday.
And with some ambassadors, right, to kind of keep people socially distant?
Yeah,
who
that's
are
the
they?
one.
Are they like volunteers? Or
they'll be volunteers working with the department to make sure that they're maintaining this information about if you're coming out, make sure you wear your mask and try to keep that distance.
So it was a really contentious city council meeting yesterday. $1.1 billion to be spent on COVID relief. There's also this issue of keeping police in schools or taking them out of schools. How's that going to get resolved?
Well, look, when you have controversial issues like this, everybody's got to sit at the table and work it out. The shouting that took place and the kind of anger that's been built up, from the federal level down to the local level. I know a lot of people have been, wanting to get outside. They've been cooped up for 3 months. And I think what we need to do is listen to our constituents, listen to our local school councils, our principals. In the instance of the police and CPS, try to find an alternative to keeping them in every school. And principals I've talked to have said there is one. When you look at the COVID funds, we're trying to get every federal dollar that we can. Those are still tax dollars, but take it off of the city books and put it on to those COVID funds through the CARES Act, and that helps our bottom line at the end of the year.
So are you saying that LSC, local school councils, should be the ultimate deciders on whether the police stay in certain schools?
Well, I think it should be the entire school community, so that they have a discussion and say, do we want off-duty police officers or do we want private security? And I think a lot of them I've talked to still want private security. But I think in black and brown communities, they've really said, look, we really want them out of there. So CPS needs to listen to both sides.
Really quickly, because we are out of time, but you're chairman of the Finance Committee. What other budget relief is there to try and solve this budget
Well,
debt?
there's some state funds that are coming down for rental assistance and for additional housing assistance. We're going to see about $396 million statewide for that. Chicago's hoping to get a good chunk of that funds, and then hopefully a second round of federal funding as well. But we've got to really pay attention to our books as well.
All right. 32nd Ward Alderman Scott Waguespack, thank you for joining us here in Bucktown. And Brandis will be back with more on the music venues in just a bit.
Still a contentious issue, Paris, the police officers in Chicago Public Schools. Thank you. Up next, a look at the history behind Juneteenth.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part through the generous support of the Julius Frankel Foundation.
Many people are marking Juneteenth as a holiday for the first time tomorrow. June 19th, or Juneteenth, commemorates the end of slavery in the United States in 1865, when enslaved people in Texas learned that they were freed. Arts correspondent Angel Edo is here with more on the history of Juneteenth and its celebration. Angel.
Brandis, thank you so much. Now, the reaction to the death of George Floyd has sparked protests around the country, and as a result has made the public more privy to the daily struggles some African Americans faced. It sparked reflection and encouraged public awareness, as we're now seeing many cities and corporate entities recognize Juneteenth as an official holiday. It wasn't until recently that I learned my very own family has a direct connection to the very first Juneteenth celebration, which happened in Texas. Now, my family is originally from Galveston, Texas, and some actually still reside there. My great-great-great-great-grandparents, Horace and Emily Skull, went to Galveston when they heard that the Emancipation was going to be read and participated in the city's first ever Juneteenth celebrations at Reedy Chapel. My family members that reside in Galveston say that there are still celebrations in the form of a prayer breakfast, parades, and picnics, and there are also reenactments. They share some of those celebrations from that same Reedy Chapel in Galveston, Texas.
Is the only place where people can come and reenact that march that actually took place, which that is part of the process every year. And every year there is a rereading of the General Order number 3 that has been referenced a few times. There's someone who actually does that, as well as the fact that sometimes there are reenactments that are dramatic presentations. There are children from different groups in town, especially that work with African Americans, who often make presentations, such as the Neocultural Center Freedom School.
Now, when we think about this celebration dating back to 1865, one may wonder why this prominent event in American history isn't of more significance. I also spoke with Professor Leslie Harris, Professor of History and American Studies at Northwestern University. She says Juneteenth was originally a Texas holiday, and some other states celebrated at other times. For example, some celebrated the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, the date it was originally issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863.
By the late 60s, early 70s, African Americans everywhere are reclaiming their history, reclaiming cultural practices. It's really a moment because of both the civil rights movement, but also the Black Power movement, when Black people really began to look to the histories and the customs of their own community. So it's not just about integration anymore, but it's also about we contributed something to this nation. We have our own customs and beliefs. And that's when Juneteenth is picked up again by people who are concerned with preserving the cultural heritage of African Americans, and it rises again to importance.
Now, today, Governor J.B. Pritzker announced that flags will be flown at half-staff to commemorate the holiday, a decision encouraged by State Representative LaShawn K. Ford.
This sends a message that the state of Illinois recognizes that Juneteenth matters. Juneteenth matters, and we recognize that there's more work to be done. And Juneteenth is going to be a day where people will be reminded of the work that has to be done for Blacks to truly be free.
Now, Representative Ford says this recognition is just the beginning. He's also proposed the governor create an Office of Equity and Inclusion. Now, as I mentioned, for some people, this is the first year really celebrating a holiday because it's finally being talked about. Now, there's a lot going on this weekend to celebrate. Many corporate entities now have recognized the day as a holiday, many offering the day off with a full pay. It's also being offered as a day of service. Now, in Chicago, there will be a number of celebrations and activities throughout the city, including virtual concerts, museum exhibits, social distancing parties, and there will also be several Black-owned restaurants offering Juneteenth-specific specials.
Angel, that's really impressive that you're able to trace your family's history back to Juneteenth, the original one in Galveston. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
We caught up with an acclaimed photographer who is retired but still active. In 1963, Steve Shapiro played Monopoly with a young Muhammad Ali, then known as Cassius Clay. He lost the game. He shot David Bowie for album covers, and he photographed on movie sets of legendary Hollywood films. But before all that, Shapiro was a journalist embedded in the civil rights movement. He took memorable pictures of Dr. King and traveled with writer James Baldwin. He told us about what he witnessed in the United States back then and what he's seeing today. Arts producer Mark Vitale has the story.
Steve Shapiro was introduced to the civil rights movement by a literary figure he was photographing.
James Baldwin was really my introduction into civil rights. It's the first time I met civil rights leaders. I had started freelancing for Life magazine, and in 1962, I read this essay that James Baldwin wrote for The New Yorker, which eventually became the book The Fire Next Time. And I was so taken by it that I asked Life if I could do an essay on him. They agreed, and he agreed, and so starting in January 1963, I traveled with him, starting in Harlem and then going into the South, into North Carolina, into Mississippi, into New Orleans.
It was a new world to this native New Yorker.
We spent a month traveling, and it just was something I had never expected. And after that, I started spending a lot of time in the South and in cities and covering various events. I was in Clarksdale with John Lewis, and I followed, of course, the Selma March and things like that.
The photos he took of James Baldwin and the civil rights movement illustrate a recent trade edition of Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time. Renewed interest has brought this edition back to the bestseller charts. Shapiro reflected on his acquaintance with Baldwin.
Baldwin was one of those people who were always on the brink of crisis. So everything seems to be a crisis, and in a way it helps, I think, feed him. He just was so quick and so smart. But basically, we never made an airplane by more than a minute, but everywhere as we went, everyone realized what an intellect they were talking to. We actually went to Medgar Evers' house, and as a joke, Medgar Evers put a towel over the license plate of our car. And it was really a joke because we knew we were under surveillance, and several months later he was shot and killed in the driveway of his house. So things were like that, and it was something I had read about, but you don't learn things only about reading. When you see them in actuality, it really changes everything. There was a notorious ice cream parlor in Durham, North Carolina, which was really very, very racist. And they had a sign on one window which said color entrance only. So we did a picture right in front of that. We walked down the street to a storefront that was an Islam meeting ground, and we did a picture in front of that as well. My favorite picture in 1965 is this middle-aged black woman with the sign, "Stop Police Killings," and it's so relevant today.
In recent years, he's photographed Black Lives Matter rallies. Last year, a WTTW photographer captured Steve Shapiro covering a climate change march in Grant Park. Now 85 years old, he sat out the most recent protests, but he recognizes something in them.
We are on the cusp of something which can be an enormous movement and can change this country in a very, very positive way. But it's still a big question as to whether that will happen or whether it will just pass by again. But the idea that suddenly in 30, 40, 50 cities in America, thousands and thousands of people are marching and the entire country is like that, that's an amazing thing in our time period. Amazing. And it's a question of a big hope as to whether that will continue and whether that can really change what we have here, because this country needs a big change at this moment.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
On our website, you'll find another story we did on Steve Shapiro. It includes his photos of David Bowie, Andy Warhol, and many more. The trade edition of The Fire Next Time is currently among Amazon's best-selling photojournalism books. And Steve Shapiro reached out today to let us know he will be out photographing Juneteenth celebrations in Chicago tomorrow. Up next, the challenges Black fathers face, both the coronavirus and violence.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Allstate. Allstate is investing in Chicago's youth. We believe good starts young. That's why we're helping our youth develop the skills they need to achieve success in life. Allstate is proud to empower the next generation of leaders.
The COVID-19 pandemic has disproportionately affected people of color in the U.S., but many African Americans argue they are facing two pandemics, not only the coronavirus, but also violence. As we approach Father's Day, families are struggling with grief and loss. George Floyd leaves behind 5 children. Rayshard Brooks leaves behind a stepson and 3 daughters. His widow spoke earlier this week in Atlanta.
I can never tell my daughter, oh, he's coming to take you skating or swimming lessons. So it's just gonna be a long time before I heal. It's gonna be a long time before this family heals.
So how can Black fathers and their families stay both safe and healthy? Joining us is Waldo Johnson Jr., an associate professor at the University of Chicago's School of Social Service Administration, who's done extensive research into African American fatherhood. Professor Johnson, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brandis.
So,
pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So let's begin with some of the persistent myths around Black fathers. A CDC study found that a majority do live with one or more of their children, and many report regularly helping with daily tasks like bathing, dressing, and homework. But you've also found that non-residents, they don't live with their children, doesn't necessarily mean non-involvement.
Absolutely. In fact, in some of the research, we find that when we look at non-resident fathers across race and ethnicity, Black non-resident fathers tend to have higher levels of involvement than their non-resident peers. And so one of the challenges with respect to research is to find ways to document the ways in which involvement occurs, given that these fathers typically do not have daily residence. We have to think about all the other ways, and as a result of technology, there are ways that enable these fathers to stay connected with their children and to engage in various forms of involvement.
Right, and if there's enough time, hopefully we can talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted that engagement. But Americans have become more widely aware of the talk. It's what many Black fathers and mothers have to give their sons and some daughters about staying safe. For example, when they're learning to drive, it's something that we covered just a couple of weeks ago. Here's a look at that.
Let's just pretend that you're pulled over by an officer. What do you do?
Put my phone on the dashboard so they know it's not a weapon. I keep my hands on the steering wheel so they can see him at all times. Let them know let them know that I am a minor, and just comply.
Now, there are different aspects to this talk, though. There can be advice on dealing with cops, which is going to be different from advice on dealing with community violence.
Fathers indeed distinguished the ways in which they thought safety could occur in these different contexts. So as the young man stated earlier, many of the fathers advised their sons when engaged in interactions with law enforcement that at all times they should be compliant.
There are different behaviors that they want them to exhibit, for example, if they're encountering gang members in their neighborhood.
Absolutely. So in those instances, fathers often advise their sons, if in fact the approach was imminent, but it was not at the point where weapons are drawn, then that the son might engage in ways to try to de-escalate. If necessary, if the offending person seems to feel that he in some ways has been disrespected, to apologize. In advance of these kinds of interventions, their sons were often advised to, in their neighborhoods, to know all of the exit points so that if they were caught in an uncomfortable situation, they would know how to escape rapidly.
And so there's also concern, though, around black men wearing masks right now. Right here last night, State Representative Cam Buckner told our Paris Schutz about a police officer who stopped him as he was leaving a store and asked for his receipt and his ID. Let's take a listen to that.
He went to his car, and I presume he was running, my name for any outstanding warrants or whatnot. Then he came back and gave me my stuff. He said, "Thank you," and began to walk away. And I asked I said, what was the impetus for this stop in the first place? And he said, you got a mask on. I can't see your face. You look like you may be up to something.
Professor, what kind of advice might black fathers give their sons at a time when they're expected to wear masks in public and something like this can happen to even a state representative?
Absolutely. Therein lies the dilemma, because as a mechanism for remaining safe from the virus, masks are strongly recommended, particularly when one is out in public. But there is this long-standing trope about black males, and particularly young black males, in terms of thinking that they are nefarious in their behavior. There are often concerns that they are less innocent when even they're explaining a particular circumstance. And so the mask, very similar to the kinds of responses that occurred in the wake of the Trayvon Martin death, represents a way in which law enforcement may very well view an attempt on the part of the young man to
Right. And some of that behavior that a father might give, it might be some of the same advice that they would give in the talk that we talked about. And you can visit our website to watch the story from Chicago Tonight's Angel Edo earlier this month on how some black families give the talk in hopes of saving a young man's life, as well as much more from our special programming, Peace and Justice. And meanwhile, my thank you to Professor Johnson. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And now we check back in with Paris Schutz, who's co-anchoring from Chicago's Wicker Park, Bucktown area. Paris.
Hey, Brandon, before we begin here, I want to acknowledge a mistake I made earlier. I referred to the Roby Hotel at the 6th Corner intersection as the Flatiron Building. It's the Roby Hotel. Flatiron Building is Kitty Corner across the street there, that long white building. So thanks to a Facebook poster for pointing that out. And now we're joined by Chris Bauman, owner of local music venues, Avondale Music Hall and the Patio Theater, also member of the Chicago Independent Venue League, which has been advocating government relief to keep these music venues operating. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Paris.
So how dire is the situation right now for music venues like yours and Subterranean and the Empty Bottle and all these great places that stage great local music?
Yeah, and I wish I could be less grim, but it's extinction mode at this point. We were first to get closed down. We're going to be last to open back up. We haven't been able to get any specific funding or availability to funding for our industry. So it's been tough, to be honest.
Is there anything on the way in terms of federal funding or state funding that you're working on?
We are working. So we've been working through NEVA, which is the National Independent Venue League, with our Save Our Stages campaign. And we've been lobbying Congress to try to get some sort of relief directly to music venues, which we kind of fit in this world where we're not restaurants. So we're not able to generate revenue if we can't have social gatherings of people at concerts. And then we have different capacities. We have large buildings with property taxes. So it's been a complicated thing, and we've been, unfortunately, haven't had any access to funds that would help yet.
And I talked to Joe Shanahan, the owner of Metro, earlier, who says that he's just not going to reopen until there's a vaccine, until all the restrictions are lifted. Is that how most of the venues are?
That's right. Because of our business, we can't operate solvently at 50% or 25% capacity or 75%. We'd actually lose more money. And so right now, we're part of phase 5 to get to 100% capacity and to not have the social distancing 6 feet away from each other. Some genres just don't work. Rock, hip hop, different EDM, some genres just do not work with social distancing in place. And so really until there's a vaccine right now, a lot of us, for the health of the community and everything else, we're in this bind.
When you say extinction, do you mean nearly every beloved local music venue here?
So NEVA, which is the national organization, has done studies that 90% of independent venues could be out of business within the next 6 months if there's no relief. So that's a big problem.
And tell us why the independent venues are so important to the city as opposed to ones that might be run by big conglomerates.
Yeah, it's such a great question. So the independent music scene in Chicago is one of the most vibrant in the world. And the rest of the world really looks at Chicago as the epicenter for independent music. We are the incubators for the Chance the Rappers and the Smashing Pumpkins and the Juice WRLDs and all these artists who go off into the rest of the world and bring shine to Chicago, right? And without us, the artists, they might not become who they become. Without us, the promoters, won't have a place to promote their shows. So there's a big trickle effect to this.
And we read today one of those big companies, Live Nation, is trying to cut salaries for staff and performers and all that. So is the alternative here a company like Live Nation controlling all the music venues, and what does that mean for music?
And that's a great point. And instead of having, I always compare it to wine, like music's kind of like wine. You can grow wine in different places of the world. Well, Chicago music is grown in Chicago, and you can't grow music out of LA and always grow it in Chicago. The same thing. It's like if Live Nation just programmed all the music in the world, you wouldn't be able to incubate that Chicago talent, right? Does that make sense? And so we have our own flavor, we have our own taste. We're really risking losing that forever.
And some of those big companies maybe don't want to take a chance on artists that they don't know that they're going to make a lot of money off of.
That's exactly right. Like, we're the ones who do take the chances. We do have our ear to the ground. We have a pulse for Chicago and what Chicago wants. And a lot of times you can't get that booking from Los Angeles or New York.
Is there any other revenue generating option right now, like live streaming a concert to an empty hall?
Yeah, no, great question. And we've done it. We're trying to do it all. Sell t-shirts, live stream, you name it. But ultimately, it's just not going to make us be able to open up again. And that's really all we want. We just want to be able to open our doors again. And that's what we're going for, and that's what we're advocating for. And the Save Our Stages on the federal level, we're working with the City of Chicago to try to get things like waiving of licenses of that nature. The state has actually been very receptive to understanding how big the culture is of music in Illinois and how the rest of the country looks at us.
And this was, according to the mayor, supposed to be the year of Chicago music. It's been quite a year. All right, Jason Bowman, thank you so much for being out here with us.
Thank you.
And Brandis, will wrap it up from Bucktown in just a bit, but now we toss it back to you.
It's sad news for those music venues, Paris, and I know that the music venues, the music industry in Chicago is personal for you. Thank you. Architect Louis Sullivan has been called the father of modernism, famous for applying his form follows function mantra to some of the world's earliest skyscrapers. But his final commission, which stands on Chicago's north side, was on quite a different scale, and now it's up for sale. Chicago Tonight producer Quinn Myers paid a visit earlier this year before the stay-at-home order took effect.
The Krause Music Store building in Chicago's Lincoln Square neighborhood has a way of catching your eye. Its ornate terracotta facade feels like it belongs more on a cathedral than a two-story building on a busy street. Maybe that's because it was designed by one of America's most innovative architects.
When we first talked to architects about renovating the building, they said, "Wow, you own a Louis Sullivan? I didn't know you could own a Louis Sullivan."
Sullivan designed the building's facade in 1922, collaborating with his former employee William Presto, who did the rest of the building. It turned out to be Sullivan's final commission. He died just 2 years later. Since 2005, the building has been owned by Studio V Design, a digital marketing company run by Pooja and Peter Vukasavich. Now, after an extensive renovation and over a decade in the space, the couple is moving on.
We're getting closer to retirement, and we're kind of looking for the next right person to come in and respect and enjoy the building the way we did.
We know Sullivan today as a titan of modern architecture, the force behind Chicago staples like the Auditorium building and the Carson Peary Scott department store. But by the time he worked on the Krause Music Store,
he was really destitute. He was an alcoholic. He was almost living on the streets, literally off the kindness of his friends.
That didn't stop Sullivan from bringing his signature ornamentation to the building, inspired by natural forms. It surrounds the massive front window, initially used to show off musical instruments.
Sullivan designed this incredibly gorgeous facade, so you can see even at the end of his career, his heart was really still in his work, and then 2 years later, he passed away.
The building housed a funeral home for decades, after several years as a music store. When the Vukasavages bought it in 2005, they jumped at the chance to marry the building's history with an updated, modern approach.
We first saw the building, yes, we loved the facade, but we also saw the potential on the inside, which frankly was quite a mess, needed a lot of work and investment.
The couple brought in architects and contractors and a feng shui expert. The result was an open office space on the inside with a Zen garden in the backyard.
Everyone walks in and feels, the power of the building and the openness and the light. And they just kind of wowed, especially the contrast between the very decorative facade, which you might say is, a different era, and then compare that to the inside, which is super contemporary.
The facade was also restored, which Pooja and Peter say had been mistreated by previous owners.
They got on one of those lifts.
Like a scaffolding device.
Hydraulic lifts. And they went up and knocked on every single block of terracotta to see if it was hollow behind, whether, it was secure.
The Vukasavages successfully lobbied to have the entire site added to the National Register of Historic Places, including the upstairs apartment with windows designed by Sullivan. They're hoping the next owner will bring that same dedication to the building.
We think it's really important to have the right person. So until that person comes along, we're going to just hold on to the building and remain stewards.
There's that ad for I forget which brand of watch, and says you never really own the watch, you take care of it for the next generation. In our small way, I kind of feel that about this building. It belongs to the city, it belongs to the neighborhood, and it's ready to move on to the next person who will appreciate it.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Quinn Myers.
And you can learn more about the former Krause Music Store on our website. And that's our show for this Thursday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news.
You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7 for the Week in Review.
Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud of its partners named Illinois leading lawyers by the Law Bulletin Publishing Company of Chicago.